The grand double doors of the courthouse swung open, revealing the cold marble floors stretching toward the judge's elevated bench. The air inside was heavy, not only with the scent of aged wood and polished brass, but with the suffocating tension of an impending verdict. Samuel Carter, a man whose face bore the scars of injustice, entered with slow, deliberate steps. He had been fighting this case for months, knowing the deck was stacked against him. He was not just fighting for himself, he was fighting against an entire system designed to crush men like him. The courtroom was packed, not just with legal professionals, but with members of the public and media who had gathered to witness what had become one of the most controversial trials in the state's history. The air crackled with whispered speculation, hushed murmurs slipping between the rows of wooden benches. Samuel could feel the weight of countless eyes upon him, their stares a mixture of curiosity, sympathy, and barely contained judgment. His case had ignited protests and debates, drawing in civil rights groups, activists, and even international attention. Some saw him as a symbol of defiance against a corrupt system, while others viewed him as a scapegoat, a warning for those who dared to challenge the powerful. At the judge's bench sat Justice Howard Lansing, a man well known for his iron-fisted rulings and a long history of favoring the privileged elite. His expression was carved from stone, unreadable yet undeniably heavy with unspoken intent. He tapped his gavel once against the polished wood, a sound that sent a shiver down Samuel's spine. The cold gaze Lansing cast over the courtroom was one of thinly veiled impatience, as if he had already decided the outcome and merely waited for the theatrics to conclude. Beside him, the prosecution team exchanged confident smirks, their polished suits and gleaming briefcases, a stark contrast to the weary determination etched into Samuel's features. They had come armed with rhetoric, armed with selective evidence, armed with the backing of those who had no interest in seeing a man like Samuel walk free. Across from them, Daniel Reeves, Samuel's defense attorney, sat with a clenched jaw, his fingers gripping the armrests of his chair as if anchoring himself against an unseen force. He had spent sleepless nights combing through legal loopholes, trying to find something, anything, that could tip the scales in their favor. But deep down, even he knew the game had been rigged long before they had set foot in the courtroom. As Samuel took his seat, his eyes locked onto a particular figure in the room, Senator Marshall Gaines. The high-ranking politician had an unsettling presence, his gaze filled with the cold confidence of someone who knew he was untouchable. He sat with an air of calculated detachment, his fingers drumming idly against the polished surface of the pew. Gaines had deep ties to the state's judiciary, and everyone knew his word held more power than any law book ever could. His very presence was a message, an unspoken declaration that no matter what transpired within these walls, he remained in control. "Order in the court," the bailiff announced, bringing everyone to attention. The sound of shuffling feet and the rustling of papers faded as the room settled into a tense silence. The trial was about to begin. The prosecutor rose first, his steps measured and deliberate as he approached the bench. He wore the smirk of a man who had played this game countless times and rarely lost. He spoke with a practiced cadence, each word sharp and calculated, designed to paint Samuel as a man of questionable morals and dangerous intentions. He recounted the allegations with the flair of a seasoned performer, weaving a narrative that fit neatly into the expectations of those who had already made up their minds. Evidence was presented, though Samuel knew well enough how evidence could be manipulated. Testimonies were read, each one a carefully curated puzzle piece in a picture that had been preordained long before he had even been arrested. Daniel Reeves fought back with equal fervor, countering with every legal maneuver at his disposal. He called forward witnesses, questioned the integrity of the evidence, and attempted to expose the inconsistencies in the prosecution's argument. But for every point he raised, the prosecution countered with a dismissive wave, an objection sustained, a judge's glare that made it clear his efforts were merely for show. The air grew thick with frustration, Samuel's pulse hammering against his temples as he watched the proceedings unfold like a slow-motion car crash. Time blurred as the hours stretched on, the weight of the trial pressing down on Samuel's shoulders like an iron yoke. He could feel the exhaustion creeping into his bones, yet he refused to let it show. He would not give them the satisfaction of seeing him break. In the back of the courtroom, Beyond the rows of reporters scribbling furiously in their notepads, beyond the spectators who had come to witness his fate, a woman sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her eyes, dark with worry, never left Samuel. She was a ghost from his past, a reminder of all he had lost and all he still had to fight for. Justice Howard Lansing cleared his throat, his gaze sweeping over the room like a judge surveying the condemned. He leaned forward slightly, as if savoring the anticipation that hung thick in the air. The next phase of the trial was about to commence, and with it, the moment that would determine whether Samuel Carter would walk free or whether he would become yet another casualty of a system that had long since been designed to fail him. The tension in the room coiled tighter, an invisible noose closing around Samuel's throat. He steeled himself, inhaling deeply, forcing his hands to remain steady as he braced for what was to come. The truth had always been a fragile thing in the hands of those who wielded power, and now, more than ever, he understood that his fate did not rest in the balance of justice, but in the hands of men who had already decided his destiny. The gavel struck the bench once more, its echo reverberating through the chamber like the toll of a funeral bell. The trial unfolded like a carefully orchestrated performance. The prosecution presented fabricated evidence, strategically placed to ensure Samuel's guilt in the eyes of the jury. Witnesses, some coerced and others outright paid, gave testimonies so well rehearsed that they might as well have been reading from a script. Every objection from Daniel was overruled, while the prosecution's every word was met with nods of approval from the bench. Samuel sat still, his hands clenched beneath the table. He had expected corruption, but the depth of it was far worse than he imagined. He had seen firsthand what happens when a man stands against powerful figures, and he had every reason to fear what was coming next. 2 weeks ago, Samuel had uncovered documents linking Judge Lansing and Senator Gaines to a web of illegal dealings, money laundering, racketeering, and bribery that stretched to the highest levels of government. He had sent these documents to an investigative journalist, but before the report could be published, the journalist disappeared without a trace. The message was clear. The people in power would stop at nothing to silence those who threatened them. As the trial continued, whispers circulated through the courtroom. The media was being heavily restricted, and sources reported that certain government officials had been ordered to keep a close watch on the proceedings. Something sinister was at play, and Samuel was right in the middle of it. Then, just when the tension seemed at its peak, the unthinkable happened. Sharp commotion erupted near the entrance of the courtroom, drawing every eye toward the heavy double doors. The bailiff moved swiftly, stepping forward as murmurs turned into gasps. A woman had forced her way inside, her face pale with urgency, her eyes darting across the room until they found Samuel. In her trembling hands, she clutched a folder, the pages inside barely held together by a frayed binding. Judge Lansing's gavel struck the bench sharply, demanding order, but the woman paid no heed. With a voice edged with desperation, she declared that she had new evidence, documents that had not been seen before, evidence that could turn the entire case on its head. Samuel's heart pounded as recognition dawned. He knew this woman. She was the assistant to the missing journalist, the one who had vanished after receiving the damning documents. The courtroom erupted into chaos. The prosecution scrambled to object, their voices rising in protest, but the defense seized the moment, insisting the evidence be reviewed. The judge's cold gaze locked onto the woman, his expression unreadable. But beneath it, Samuel detected something: fear. For the first time since the trial began, the balance of power had shifted, even if only slightly. The folder was passed to the defense, Daniel's fingers gripping the papers as he skimmed the contents. His jaw tightened, his eyes widening as he absorbed the implications of what he was holding. He turned to Samuel, a flicker of something unreadable passing between them before he straightened and faced the judge. With unwavering determination, he declared that this evidence could prove not only Samuel's innocence, but also expose a conspiracy that reached far beyond this courtroom. Justice Lansing hesitated, his fingers tapping against the polished wood of the bench. He could feel the weight of the room pressing in on him, the expectant eyes of the jury, the media, the public. Gaines sat motionless, but there was a sharpness in his gaze, a silent warning that no one else seemed to catch. The senator's power was formidable, and even the judge was not immune to his influence. The prosecution demanded the evidence be dismissed, claiming it was illegally obtained and therefore inadmissible. The defense countered, arguing that suppressing it would be an obstruction of justice. The tension in the room coiled tighter, a battle of words unfolding with the gravity of a war being waged. Every second felt stretched thin, a precarious balance teetering on the edge of collapse. Then, just as it seemed Lansing would rule in favor of the prosecution, a voice from the back of the room interrupted. A man stood, his presence previously unnoticed, his face shadowed beneath the dim light of the chandeliers. He carried himself with an air of authority, his suit impeccably pressed, his movements deliberate. When he spoke, his voice was calm yet commanding, cutting through the clamor with chilling precision. He introduced himself as a federal investigator, stating that he had been monitoring this case from the beginning. He revealed that the journalist who had gone missing had left behind a contingency plan, a duplicate set of documents hidden away, ready to be uncovered if anything suspicious happened to him. The woman who had burst into the courtroom had retrieved them, and fearing for her own safety, had waited for the right moment to present them. Silence hung over the room, thick with anticipation. The judge's face remained impassive, but the tightening of his grip on the gavel betrayed his inner turmoil. He knew that ignoring this would invite scrutiny beyond his control, that to dismiss it outright could risk exposure of something far greater than one man's fate. The prosecution looked to Gaines, seeking guidance, but the senator's expression remained unreadable. He leaned back in his seat, his fingers steepled, as if already calculating his next move. Samuel could see the wheels turning, the quiet assessment of whether this unexpected revelation could be contained or if it was already too late. Judge Lansing exhaled slowly before announcing that the court would recess. The gavel struck once more, but this time its sound did not carry the finality it once had. Samuel felt the shift, the possibility of a different outcome creeping into the edges of his thoughts. He was not free yet, but for the first time the walls around him did not seem as impenetrable as before. As the crowd dispersed, whispers filled the air, speculation running rampant. Samuel turned to Daniel, who met his gaze with newfound resolve. The fight was far from over, but the game had changed. And in that moment, Samuel understood one thing. Sometimes, even in the darkest corridors of power, a single crack was all it took to bring everything crashing down. In a move that stunned even the most cynical observers, Judge Lansing called for an unscheduled recess. The court fell silent as he stood, adjusting his robe before delivering a chilling decree. Mr. Carter, your actions have endangered the very fabric of our judicial system. Given the gravity of your defiance and the influence you attempt to exert, I find it necessary to make an example of you. The doors to the courtroom burst open, and 2 armed officers strode in, holding something wrapped in a white cloth. The room gasped in horror as the bundle was unveiled, Samuel's newborn baby, taken from his wife just hours earlier. His wife's cries echoed outside the courtroom walls as she was restrained from entering. Samuel rose from his seat, his vision blurring with rage and terror. "No! No! Stop this!" But Judge Lansing merely gave a nod. With a cold, calculated movement, he signaled to one of the officers. In an instant, a gunshot rang out, and the cries of the infant were silenced forever. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Gasps, screams, and the desperate sobs of those who still had the capacity to believe in justice filled the air. Samuel collapsed to his knees, his body shaking violently as grief consumed him. Then, something changed. A shift, unseen but deeply felt. The silence that followed wasn't one of helplessness. It was the calm before the storm. The weight of the act settled over the room like a suffocating fog. For a moment, even the most loyal followers of the system were struck speechless, their hands trembling at their sides. The reporters, their cameras forgotten, stood frozen, unable to comprehend the horror unfolding before them. The jury, handpicked to condemn Samuel, suddenly found themselves questioning the very role they played in this grotesque display of power. Senator Gaines remained seated, his expression unreadable, but his fingers drummed against the polished wooden surface before him. He had orchestrated many acts of corruption, but this was different. This was something he could not afford. Witnesses, too many of them, all now irreversibly entangled in what had just occurred. His mind worked quickly, calculating the cost of this action, the risk it posed to his carefully maintained empire. Samuel's body rocked forward, his hands pressing into the cold marble floor as if trying to root himself in a world that no longer made sense. He could hear nothing beyond the ringing in his ears, see nothing beyond the dark void of his grief. And then, slowly, the ringing gave way to something else. A whisper of movement, the shuffling of feet, the clearing of throats. He lifted his head, blinking through the haze, and saw them, faces staring back at him, not in pity, but in recognition, in understanding, in fury. A ripple of unrest spread through the crowd, a fire catching dry tinder. The first voice rose in protest, a single trembling accusation thrown into the air. Then another, louder this time, steadier. The bailiff shifted, his eyes darting toward the judge as the room began to tremble with the murmur of unrest. The officers who had carried out the order stood uncertain, their grips tightening on their weapons, but hesitation now lined their once firm expressions. Samuel had lost everything. There was no longer room for fear, no space for doubt. He pushed himself up from the floor, his breath ragged, his body alight with something he had not felt before: purpose. This was no longer about him. This was about all of them. Daniel Reeves moved first. The defense attorney, always a man of measured words and careful restraint, now stepped forward with fire in his eyes. He pointed at Lansing, his voice ringing through the chamber, accusing the judge of murder in the presence of the people. His words cracked the thin veneer of control, shattering the illusion of law and order. The people rose. The spectators, the reporters, the bystanders who had come only to watch, now found themselves a part of something larger than a trial. The guards rushed to contain the growing chaos, but for the first time their power was slipping. It was no longer Samuel Carter who was on trial. It was the very institution that had sentenced him before he had even spoken a word in his own defense. Judge Lansing slammed his gavel, demanding silence, but the noise swallowed him whole. The chants of injustice rang louder, the weight of public outrage pressing in from all sides. Gaines stood then, his patience worn thin, and with a single motion, his security detail surged forward. Samuel watched as power struggled against inevitability. The people would not be silenced, not anymore. This was not just about one life stolen in cold blood. This was about every life crushed beneath the boot of men like Lansing and Gaines. The first gunshot came not from the officers, but from within the crowd. A reporter, camera still slung over his shoulder, had drawn a weapon, his face carved from stone as he aimed at the judge's bench. The shot missed, striking the wood just inches from Lansing's hand. The courtroom exploded into motion, bodies colliding, chairs overturning, screams splitting the air as years of repression erupted into a moment of reckoning. Samuel did not run. He turned, his gaze locking onto Daniel, onto the few figures in the room who still fought for something beyond survival. They had minutes, seconds perhaps, before the full weight of the system bore down upon them. But they would not go quietly. They would not be erased. Gaines moved swiftly, his guards forming a tight wall around him as they pushed toward the exit. Lansing scrambled back, his authority crumbling beneath him. The officers who had once stood resolute now hesitated, caught between their duty and the undeniable truth that what had just happened could never be justified. The city outside would soon know. The world would soon know. And Samuel Carter, a man who had been given every reason to break, stood unbowed in the center of it all. The storm had arrived. 5 minutes later, everything changed. A sudden explosion outside the courthouse sent shockwaves through the building, rattling the windows and filling the air with the acrid scent of smoke. Armed men, masked and moving with deadly precision, stormed into the room, their weapons raised, silencing security before they had a chance to react. The chaos that had begun with outrage now escalated into full-fledged insurrection. Daniel Reeves, the defense attorney, rose from his seat, the tension in his frame giving way to cold determination. With measured movements, he removed his suit jacket, revealing a concealed vest beneath. He had planned for this moment. For weeks, he had worked in the shadows, gathering allies, those who had been wronged by the system, those who had lost faith in the law, those who had nothing left to lose. The battle for justice had moved beyond words and verdicts. It had become a war. The masked men were not mere mercenaries. They were former law enforcement officers, disillusioned soldiers, and ordinary citizens who had borne witness to corruption too deep to be ignored. They moved with intent, rounding up the corrupt officials one by one, dragging them from their pedestals of power. Judge Lansing, for the first time in his storied career of iron-fisted rulings, looked afraid. The cold authority he once wielded had no weight here. Senator Gaines, realizing that no backroom deal could save him now, attempted to flee, but he was swiftly apprehended, his protests swallowed by the roar of the uprising. Samuel, still on his knees, felt the pressure of a firm hand on his shoulder. Daniel was beside him, his gaze unshaken. They weren't finished yet. Justice wasn't a verdict. It was the reckoning that came when the people refused to be silenced. The courtroom, once a bastion of oppression, had become a stage for revolution. Cameras, now in the hands of those who sought the truth, broadcast the unfolding events live to millions. Screens across the nation flickered to life, exposing the depths of corruption, the atrocities committed in the name of power. The judiciary, the high-ranking officials, and the politicians who had long considered themselves untouchable were now laid bare before the world. By the time the dust settled, the government was in disarray. Protests ignited into full-scale revolutions, courtrooms burned as symbols of a broken system, and those who once held power found themselves at the mercy of the very people they had spent years oppressing. This was not the justice that the law had promised. It was justice torn from the grasp of those who had hoarded it for themselves. Samuel stood amidst the wreckage, his breath steady despite the firestorm raging around him. He turned his gaze skyward, the first light of dawn breaking through the smoke-stained clouds. For the first time he felt it, the weight of history shifting, the birth of something new. Justice had not been given. It had been taken,